What if I told you that Australia was founded as a prison because America said no, that the government once lost a prime minister in the ocean, and that emus won a war against the military? These aren't jokes. They're verified facts from the most bizarre national history on Earth. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to walk through 99 verified facts about Australian history that somehow never made it into your textbook. We're not talking about cute koala bears or surfing culture. We're talking about nuclear bombs being detonated on Aboriginal land, a government coup backed by the CIA, children being stolen by government policy, and wars fought against birds. These are real events with real consequences that shaped one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. So, grab some water, get comfortable, and let's talk about the history they didn't want you to know. Fact 1. Australia exists because America said no before 1776. Britain shipped convicts to America. Roughly 50,000 British criminals were transported to the American colonies between 1718 and 1775. Britain got rid of criminals, America got cheap labor, everyone was happy. Then America won independence, creating an immediate problem. Britain still had criminals, lots of them. Prisons were overflowing. The hulks, old warships converted into floating prisons on the Thames, were packed beyond capacity. Britain needed somewhere else to dump their criminals. They considered West Africa, Gibraltar, even just executing more people. Then, someone remembered Captain James Cook had sailed around Australia's east coast in 1770. Joseph Banks suggested Botany Bay as a penal colony. So, Britain sent convicts to the other side of the planet because America became independent. Australia exists as a modern nation because of American independence. Fact 2. The First Fleet was a floating nightmare. On May 13th, 1787, 11 ships left Portsmouth carrying about 1,400 people, roughly 780 of them convicts. The journey to Australia took 8 months across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. 8 months on a wooden ship in the 18th century was already brutal, but these ships were deliberately packed beyond reasonable capacity. Convicts were kept below deck in chains for most of the voyage. The stench was overpowering. Disease spread constantly through the cramped, airless holds. 48 people died during the journey, which was actually considered a success by 18th century standards. Other convict ships had mortality rates of 30% or higher. The fact that only about 3% died on the First Fleet was seen as excellent management. The ships arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788 and immediately realized Joseph Banks had oversold the location. The soil was poor and sandy, fresh water was scarce, the harbour wasn't suitable for large ships. Captain Arthur Phillip, the expedition's commander, sailed north and found a much better harbour at Port Jackson, which he named Sydney Cove. On January 26, 1788, the British flag was raised at Sydney Cove. That date is now celebrated as Australia Day, though it's increasingly controversial because for Aboriginal people, it marks the beginning of invasion and dispossession. Fact 3. Convicts were transported for absurd crimes. Here's what could get you sentenced to transportation to Australia in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The crimes were often absurdly minor. Stealing bread. That's not an exaggeration. Multiple convicts were transported for life for stealing a single loaf of bread because they were starving. Stealing anything worth more than 1 shilling, about a day's wages for a labourer, could result in transportation to the other side of the world. Poaching rabbits on aristocratic land got you 7 years in Australia. Being a member of a trade union was illegal and could get you transported. Political activism, especially after the French Revolution made the British government paranoid, was punished with transportation. 1 woman was transported for 7 years for stealing cheese. Another convict was sent to Australia for stealing 12 cucumber plants from a garden. A 70-year-old woman was transported for stealing a piece of cloth. The youngest convict on the First Fleet was John Hudson, who was 13 years old. He'd been convicted of stealing clothes and a pistol. The oldest was Dorothy Hanlon, who was 82 and had been convicted of perjury. Between 1788 and 1868, approximately 162,000 convicts were transported to Australia. The vast majority were guilty of property crimes, not violent offences. They were poor people who'd stolen to survive, or had committed minor crimes that wealthy British society decided deserved exile to a penal colony on the other side of the planet. Fact 4. Aboriginal Australians had been there for 65,000 years. When the First Fleet arrived in 1788, Australia wasn't empty. It had been continuously inhabited for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer. Archaeological evidence suggests Aboriginal Australians are the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. The Aboriginal population before British colonisation is estimated between 750,000 and 1.25 million people, divided into over 250 distinct language groups. Each group had its own language, customs, and connection to specific territories. They had complex social structures, trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, sophisticated land management practices, including controlled burning to prevent bushfires, and astronomical knowledge encoded in oral traditions passed down through millennia. The British declared Australia terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This wasn't ignorance. British colonizers could see Aboriginal people. They met them, traded with them, and fought with them. But terra nullius was a legal fiction that allowed Britain to claim the land without signing treaties or paying compensation. This legal fiction wasn't overturned until 1992 in the Mabo decision, when the High Court of Australia finally recognised that Aboriginal people had owned the land before British arrival. That's 204 years of official denial of Aboriginal ownership. Fact 5. The British deliberately spread smallpox. Within 18 months of the First Fleet's arrival, a smallpox epidemic devastated the Aboriginal population around Sydney. Estimates suggest 50 to 90% of the Aboriginal people in the region died. The official story for centuries was that smallpox arrived accidentally, perhaps from contact with British sailors who'd been exposed in Asia. But there's compelling evidence the British deliberately introduced smallpox as biological warfare. Watkin Tench, a British officer, wrote about discussions among colonists about using smallpox against Aboriginal resistance. Governor Arthur Phillip had access to smallpox variolous matter, dried scabs from smallpox victims that could be used for primitive vaccination or as a biological weapon. The epidemic began in April 1789, more than a year after the First Fleet arrived. If it had come with the fleet, it would have appeared earlier. The pattern of infection was concentrated around Sydney, not spread along the coast as it would be from ships arriving at different points. Whether the smallpox was deliberately released or accidentally escaped from British medical supplies, the result was the same. The Aboriginal population around Sydney was decimated, making British expansion easier. It was the first of many epidemics that would kill Aboriginal people throughout the 19th century. Fact 6. The Castle Hill Rebellion was Australia's first uprising. On March 4, 1804, between 200 and 300 Irish convicts staged a rebellion in Castle Hill near Sydney. They were mostly political prisoners who'd been transported for participating in the 1798 Irish Rebellion against British rule in Ireland. The rebels, led by Philip Cunningham and William Johnston, planned to capture weapons from government stores, overthrow the colonial government, and either take control of the colony or somehow escape to freedom, possibly to China or Tahiti. They armed themselves with pikes, farm tools, and a few stolen muskets. The rebellion was poorly organized and quickly suppressed. The colonial government sent soldiers and armed settlers to confront the rebels. At a place now called Vinegar Hill, named after a famous battle site in the Irish Rebellion, the two forces met for a confrontation. Major George Johnston offered to negotiate. Cunningham and Johnston approached under a flag of truce, thinking they'd discuss terms. They were immediately captured in violation of the truce. Johnston then ordered his troops to open fire on the remaining rebels. At least 15 rebels were killed in the fighting. 9 were later hanged in public executions meant to terrorize other convicts. Many others were brutally flogged, receiving hundreds of lashes each, which often proved fatal due to infection. The rebellion failed completely, but it demonstrated that convicts weren't passively accepting their sentences and were willing to fight for freedom. Fact 7. Tasmania committed genocide. Tasmania was colonized starting in 1803. The Indigenous Tasmanian Aboriginal people had lived there for at least 35,000 years. What happened to them is genocide. The British fought the Black War from 1824 to 1831. Settlers formed hunting parties. The colonial government offered bounties, £5 for an adult, £2 for a child, dead or alive. In 1830, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur organized the Black Line, 2,200 armed settlers forming a human chain across Tasmania to round up Aboriginal people. They captured exactly 2 people. By 1847, the population had been reduced from 5,000 to 10,000 people to fewer than 300. Survivors were relocated to Flinders Island, where conditions killed most. The last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, Truganini, died in 1876. Textbooks taught that Tasmanian Aboriginals were extinct, which was false. Descendants survived, but the full-blooded population was eliminated through deliberate policy. Fact 8. Australia accepted convicts during the gold rush. You'd think that once Australia discovered gold and became wealthy, they'd stop accepting convicts. Wrong. Gold was discovered in New South Wales in 1851, setting off a massive gold rush that transformed Australia. Tens of thousands of people from around the world flooded into the colonies seeking fortune. The population of Victoria, where the richest goldfields were located, exploded from 77,000 in 1851 to over 500,000 by 1861. Australia was becoming wealthy. Meanwhile, Britain kept sending convicts. The last convict ship, the Hougoumont, arrived in Western Australia in 1868, carrying 279 convicts. That's 17 years after the gold rush began. Western Australia had actually requested continued convict transportation because they wanted the cheap labour and the British government funding that came with managing convicts. The eastern colonies had stopped accepting convicts earlier. New South Wales ended transportation in 1840. Tasmania stopped in 1853, but Western Australia kept the system going until 1868 because they needed workers to build infrastructure. So Australia simultaneously had free settlers getting spectacularly rich from gold discoveries and convicts in chains building roads and buildings. The contrast was absurd. Factor 9. The Eureka Stockade was Australia's only armed rebellion. In 1854, gold miners in Ballarat, Victoria, were fed up with the government's license fees and lack of political representation. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same complaint that sparked the American Revolution. Miners were required to pay 30 shillings a month for a mining license, whether they found gold or not. That was a huge amount of money for miners who might not find any gold. License inspections were aggressive and often violent. Miners had no vote, no political representation, yet were being heavily taxed. It was taxation without representation. On November 30th, 1854, miners built a stockade, a makeshift fortress of timber and earth, at Eureka. They raised a flag, the Eureka flag with a white cross and 5 stars on a blue background. About 150 miners, led by Peter Lalore, swore an oath to defend their rights and freedoms. The colonial government sent soldiers and police to crush the rebellion. Early in the morning of December 3rd, government forces attacked the stockade. The battle was short and brutal, lasting about 20 minutes. At least 27 people died, mostly miners. The government forces overwhelmed the poorly armed and outnumbered defenders. The rebellion was crushed militarily, but it had huge political impact. The miners who were charged with treason were acquitted by sympathetic juries. Public opinion turned against the government. The license fee was abolished and replaced with a more reasonable tax. Miners gained the right to vote and stand for parliament. The Eureka Stockade became a symbol of Australian resistance to unjust authority and the fight for democratic rights. The Eureka flag is still used today by unions and protest movements as a symbol of rebellion against unfair government. Fact 10. Chinese miners faced violent racism. During the 1850s gold rushes, tens of thousands of Chinese miners came to Australia. By 1859, about 20% of Victoria's male population was Chinese. They faced immediate violent racism. Victoria imposed a £10 entry tax on Chinese immigrants in 1855. Chinese miners landed in South Australia instead and walked hundreds of kilometres to Victorian goldfields. In 1857, the Buckland Riot saw European miners attack Chinese camps. In 1860 and 1861, at Lambing Flat, thousands of Europeans attacked Chinese miners, beating them and destroying their belongings. Police did little. Colonial governments responded by restricting Chinese immigration further. This was Australia's first racially based immigration restriction, setting a pattern for the White Australia policy. Fact 11. Bushrangers were folk heroes. Bushrangers were outlaws who operated in the Australian bush, robbing travellers, banks and homesteads. They were essentially Australian bandits, and many of them became folk heroes, celebrated in songs and stories. The most famous was Ned Kelly. Born in 1854 to Irish convict descendants in Victoria, Kelly had run-ins with police from a young age. His family was poor, and the police harassed them constantly. In 1878, after a confrontation where police tried to arrest his brother Dan, Kelly and his gang went into hiding in the bush. The Kelly gang consisted of Ned Kelly, his brother Dan, and friends Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. They robbed banks and evaded police for 2 years, becoming legendary in the process. They robbed the bank at Euroa, getting away with £2,000. They robbed the bank at Geraldary, taking £2,140, a massive sum at the time. At Geraldary, Kelly wrote or dictated a long letter, the Geraldary Letter, explaining his grievances against police corruption and abuse of power. It's an extraordinary 8,000-word document, mixing political commentary, personal grievance, and grandiose claims about fighting for justice. The Kelly gang's end came in June 1880 at Glenrowan. They took hostages at a hotel, planning to derail a police train and ambush the survivors. But a schoolteacher managed to warn the police. A siege began that would become legendary. The Kelly gang wore homemade armour they'd crafted from stolen ploughshares, metal plates covering their torsos and bizarre cylindrical helmets that made them look like medieval knights. The armour could stop bullets to the torso, but left their arms and legs vulnerable. Kelly, wearing his armour, walked out of the burning hotel, shooting at police in the early morning darkness. Police fired at him repeatedly. Bullets bounced off the armour. He kept advancing like something out of a nightmare. Finally, he was shot in the unarmoured legs and arms and collapsed. He was captured alive. The other gang members died inside the hotel when it was set on fire. Kelly was tried for the murder of police officers and sentenced to death. He was hanged in Melbourne on November 11th, 1880. His reported last words were, "Such is life," which has become a famous Australian saying. Kelly became a legend. He was seen as a victim of corrupt police, a champion of the poor Irish against the English establishment, an Australian rebel who fought authority. His armour is displayed in the State Library of Victoria. His story has been told in countless books, films, and songs. He appears on stamps and paintings. Whether Kelly was a Robin Hood figure fighting injustice or just a violent criminal robbing banks is still hotly debated in Australia. Fact 12. Aboriginal children were stolen by government policy. Between approximately 1910 and 1970, Australian federal and state government agencies forcibly removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. Estimates suggest between 10 to 33% of Aboriginal children were taken during this period. These children are known as the stolen generations. The policy was based on eugenicist beliefs that Aboriginal people were a dying race, and that mixed-race children, particularly those with lighter skin, would be better off raised in white society. Government officials, police, and welfare officers had the legal power to remove children without parental consent and without a court order. They could simply take children from their families. Children as young as babies were taken from their mothers. They were sent to institutions, church missions, or placed with white foster families. In these places, they were forbidden from speaking their Aboriginal languages or practicing their culture. Many were told their parents were dead or didn't want them. Some were adopted out to white families and never learned their original Aboriginal identities, or even that they were Aboriginal. The psychological trauma was immense and multi-generational. Children lost connection to family, culture, language, and land, which are fundamental to Aboriginal identity. Many suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in institutions. As adults, members of the stolen generations experience higher rates of mental health problems, substance abuse, poverty, and difficulty forming stable relationships. The trauma was then passed on to their own children. The policy wasn't officially ended until the early 1970s, though in practice, Aboriginal children continued to be removed at disproportionate rates through child welfare systems. The Australian government didn't formally apologise until February 13, 2008, when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a national apology to the stolen generations in Parliament. But no national compensation scheme was ever established, and many survivors died before receiving any acknowledgement of the grievous wrongs done to them. Fact 14. Australia nearly became Japanese in World War II in 1942. Australia came genuinely close to being invaded by Japan. This isn't exaggeration or nationalist mythology. Japanese forces were advancing south through Southeast Asia, had captured Singapore in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history, and were actively bombing northern Australia. On February 19, 1942, Japanese aircraft carriers launched 242 aircraft to attack Darwin, the capital of Australia's Northern Territory. The attack killed at least 243 people, possibly more, and destroyed or damaged ships, aircraft, and infrastructure. It was the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia, larger than Pearl Harbor in terms of bombs dropped. The official death toll may be understated because Aboriginal victims weren't always counted. Darwin wasn't a one-time attack. The city was bombed 64 times during World War II. Other northern Australian towns were also attacked. Broome, Katherine, Wyndham, and Derby all experienced Japanese air raids. Australia's north was under genuine threat. Japanese submarines operated in Australian waters with disturbing frequency. They sank ships along the coast. Most audaciously, in May 1942, Japanese midget submarines penetrated Sydney Harbour itself and attacked Allied warships. They sank a ferry, the Kootabool, killing 21 sailors. The submarines were eventually destroyed, but the attack showed that even Sydney, thousands of kilometers from Japanese bases, was within reach. The Japanese military had detailed plans for a potential invasion of Australia. Documents captured after the war showed invasion plans existed. Whether they would have actually invaded is debated by historians. Australia's size and distance made invasion logistically extraordinarily difficult. But the plans existed, the capability was there, and Japanese forces were close enough to make invasion a terrifying possibility. Australia's defence situation was desperate. Most of Australia's military forces, the best trained and equipped troops, were deployed overseas fighting in Europe and North Africa. The defence of Australia itself relied on poorly trained militia and whatever American forces could be rushed to the region. Prime Minister John Curtin made a momentous decision. He recalled Australian troops from the Middle East to defend Australia. This enraged Winston Churchill, who wanted Australian forces to continue fighting in North Africa. But Curtin put Australia's survival first. He also made a crucial policy shift, publicly declaring that Australia looked to America, not Britain, for military support. This was revolutionary. For over 150 years, Australia had relied on Britain. Curtin's 1941 New Year's message essentially said that era was over. Australia would align with the United States. Fact 15. The Battle of Brisbane was Australians fighting Americans. With over 100,000 American troops in Australia during World War II, tensions exploded on November 26th and 27th, 1942, in the Battle of Brisbane. A fight at a canteen escalated. Over 2 nights, thousands of Australian and American servicemen fought in Brisbane streets. Weapons included fists, bottles, and eventually firearms. 1 Australian died, hundreds were injured. The government suppressed news. The full story didn't emerge for decades. Americans were paid 5 times more than Australians. They had better uniforms and access to luxury goods. Australian soldiers resented Americans being seen as more attractive to Australian women, while Australians were deployed overseas. The saying was, Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Australians were underpaid, undersexed, and under MacArthur. Fact 16. Australia tested British nuclear bombs. Between 1952 and 1963, Britain conducted nuclear weapons tests in Australia, 7 major tests plus hundreds of smaller tests involving radioactive materials. The first, Operation Hurricane, was on October 3, 1952, on the Montebello Islands. The bomb was detonated inside a ship. More tests followed at Emu Field in Maralinga in South Australia. The British and Australian governments claimed the areas were uninhabited. This was false. Aboriginal people lived in and travelled through these areas. They were exposed to radioactive fallout, safety measures were inadequate, Aboriginal people weren't properly evacuated. Servicemen were exposed to dangerous radiation. Radioactive materials were left in the environment. Long-term effects included cancer, birth defects, and land contamination that remains radioactive today. Australia gained nothing. Britain got nuclear weapons, Australia got radiation. Fact 17. A dingo really did take a baby. In 1980, Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were camping at Uluru with their children. On August 17th, their 9-week-old daughter Azaria disappeared. Lindy claimed a dingo had taken the baby. Investigations initially supported this, but forensic evidence was misinterpreted. Public suspicion grew. In 1982, Lindy was convicted of murder. Michael was convicted as accessory. Lindy was sentenced to life imprisonment. The forensic evidence was later proven wrong. In 1986, Azaria's jacket was found near a dingo lair, exactly where Lindy said. Lindy was released. The conviction was overturned. It wasn't until 2012 that a coroner officially ruled a dingo had taken Azaria. The Chamberlains had been telling the truth. Lindy spent over 3 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Fact 18. Prime Minister Harold Holt disappeared in the ocean. On December 17, 1967, Prime Minister Harold Holt went swimming at Cheviot Beach near Portsea. He walked into the ocean and vanished. His body was never found. Holt was an experienced swimmer, but Cheviot Beach was dangerous with strong currents. Friends advised against swimming. Holt ignored them. Witnesses saw him swimming strongly, then struggling. He disappeared beneath the waves. Despite massive searches, no trace was found. Conspiracy theories claim Chinese submarines or staged death. The reality is almost certainly drowning. He was tired, under stress, had drunk alcohol, and got caught in a rip current. Australia named a swimming pool after him. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre opened in 1969. A sitting Prime Minister simply vanished into the ocean. Fact 19. The CIA helped remove an Australian Prime Minister. In 1975, Australia had a constitutional crisis, ending with the Governor-General dismissing the elected Prime Minister. Evidence suggests CIA involvement. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was elected in 1972. His government was reformist, establishing universal healthcare, recognising Aboriginal land rights, withdrawing from Vietnam. Whitlam questioned Australia's intelligence relationship with the US, discovered the CIA facility at Pine Gap, and threatened to reveal CIA activities. This alarmed America. Pine Gap was crucial to US intelligence. In 1975, the opposition-controlled Senate blocked Whitlam's budget. Whitlam refused to resign. Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed Whitlam on November 11, 1975, and appointed opposition leader Malcolm Fraser as caretaker. Declassified documents show CIA monitoring of Whitlam. Evidence suggests Kerr had contact with CIA-connected individuals before the dismissal. Whether the CIA directly ordered it isn't proven, but the CIA wanted Whitlam removed, and he was removed in an unprecedented use of vice-regal power. Fact 20. Australia had a White Australia policy. For 70 years, from 1901 to 1973, Australia had immigration policies explicitly designed to keep Australia white. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 included a dictation test where immigration officers could require any prospective immigrant to take a test in any European language. The test was deliberately used to exclude non-white immigrants. Officers would choose a language the applicant didn't know. A Japanese person might be tested in Hungarian. The slogan was "Keep Australia White." This was mainstream consensus supported by both major parties for decades. The policy began to be dismantled in the 1960s. The dictation test was abolished in 1958. By 1973, the Whitlam government officially ended the White Australia policy. But effects lasted longer. Public attitudes didn't change overnight. Fact 21. Aborigines weren't counted in the census until 1967. Until 1967, Aboriginal Australians were not counted in the national census. Section 127 of the Constitution stated Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. In 1967, a referendum removed this section and gave the federal government power to make laws for Aboriginal people. The referendum passed with over 90% support. After 1967, Aboriginal people were counted, and the federal government could make special laws for them. This is often portrayed as Aboriginal people gaining citizenship, but that's not accurate. They'd technically been citizens all along, though with restricted rights. What the referendum did was remove the explicit constitutional exclusion from the population count. For 66 years, Aboriginal Australians lived in a country that officially didn't count them as part of the population. Fact 22. The Sydney Opera House was 1,400% over budget. The original 1957 estimate was £7 million. Completion by 1963. The actual cost was $102 million, roughly 15 times the estimate, 1,400% over budget. It was completed in 1973, 10 years late. Designer Jørn Utsen's design was revolutionary but extraordinarily difficult to build. The roof shells required complex engineering never done before. Construction began in 1959. Problems emerged immediately. Costs exploded. The government and Utsen clashed. In 1966, Utsen resigned and left Australia. He never returned to see the completed building. Despite catastrophic cost and delay, the Opera House became one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Over 8 million people visit annually. Fact 23. Australia once banned the Beatles. In 1964, the Beatles wanted to tour Australia. The government nearly refused entry because their hair was too long. The musicians' union objected. Concerned British musicians were taking jobs from Australians. The immigration minister debated approving visas. The government received pressure from unions, conservatives horrified by long hair, and fans desperate to see them. Eventually, visas were approved. When the Beatles arrived in June 1964, over 300,000 people lined Adelaide streets, the largest crowd the Beatles ever attracted anywhere. Australia nearly denied entry to the Beatles, then went completely insane with Beatlemania. Fact 24. Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin on Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve, 1974, Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin. By Christmas morning, 70% of the city was destroyed. 71 people were dead. Over 25,000 of 47,000 residents were evacuated. Tracy was small but intense. Wind speeds exceeded 217 kilometers per hour. Most buildings weren't built to withstand cyclones. Roofs were ripped off, walls collapsed, debris became deadly projectiles. The evacuation was the largest airlift in Australia's peacetime history. Military and civilian aircraft flew thousands of evacuees to cities across Australia. Darwin was rebuilt with strict cyclone-resistant building codes, but many evacuees never returned. Cyclone Tracy destroyed a city on Christmas Day. Fact 25. Australia started as a dumping ground for mentally ill people. Britain didn't just send criminals to Australia. They also transported people classified as mentally ill, starting in the 1790s. Anyone diagnosed with insanity could be transported if authorities deemed them troublesome. The definition was extremely broad and often politically motivated. Political dissidents, religious nonconformists, and women who didn't conform to social expectations were sometimes declared mad and shipped to Australia. Conditions for mentally ill convicts were appalling. They were chained in ships' holds with regular convicts. Upon arrival, there were no mental health facilities. They were sent to work gangs or left in overcrowded hospitals with no treatment. Some weren't actually mentally ill, just inconvenient to powerful people in Britain. Getting rid of someone by having them declared insane and transported was easier than normal legal processes. Fact 26. The first police force was made entirely of convicts. In 1789, Governor Arthur Phillip established the Night Watch in Sydney, the first organised police force in Australia. It was made up entirely of the best-behaved convicts. The people enforcing law in the colony were criminals. The logic was that free settlers were too few, and using soldiers for police work was inefficient. So, convicts policed other convicts. This created predictable problems. Corruption was rampant. Some watchmen took bribes, others committed crimes while on duty. The system persisted for decades. Even when free settlers began forming police forces, former convicts often joined because they knew the criminal element. Fact 27. Botany Bay was named then immediately abandoned. Captain James Cook named Botany Bay in 1770 because botanist Joseph Banks collected many plant specimens there. The name suggests it was ideal. It wasn't. When the first fleet arrived in 1788, they quickly realized Botany Bay was terrible. Poor soil, scarce water, shallow harbour. After a few days, Governor Phillip sailed north and found Port Jackson, now Sydney Harbour, which had everything Botany Bay lacked. The famous Botany Bay was abandoned almost immediately. The actual settlement was at Sydney Cove. But Botany Bay remained the symbolic name, used in Britain as shorthand for transportation. Convicts were said to be going to Botany Bay, even though none actually went there. They went to Sydney. The name stuck despite being geographically inaccurate. Fact 28. Convicts built Australia's finest architecture. Many of Australia's most beautiful historic buildings were designed by convicts and built by convict labour. The most famous convict architect was Francis Greenway. Greenway was transported in 1814 for forgery. He'd been a successful architect in Britain. In Sydney, Governor Lachlan Macquarie recognised his talent and appointed him civil architect. Greenway designed some of Sydney's most iconic buildings: St James's Church, Hyde Park Barracks, St Matthew's Church in Windsor. His buildings are masterpieces of Georgian colonial architecture. He's the only convict to appear on Australian currency, featured on the old $10 note. But Greenway's story didn't end well. He argued constantly with officials about money and recognition. He was dismissed from government service. He died in poverty in 1837, largely forgotten. Convict labour built roads, bridges, public buildings, and infrastructure throughout Australia. The quality was often excellent because skilled tradesmen were among the transported convicts. They built structures that still stand over 200 years later. Fact 29. Tasmania had the worst convict prison in the Empire. Van Diemen's Land, renamed Tasmania in 1856, received convicts longer than any other colony. Transportation to Tasmania didn't end until 1853. Port Arthur, established in 1833, was a prison for repeat offenders. Convicts who committed crimes after arriving in Australia were sent there. It was designed to be psychologically terrifying. Port Arthur used solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. The theory was that isolation would lead to reformation. In practice, it drove men insane. Prisoners weren't allowed to talk. They wore hoods outside their cells so they couldn't see each other's faces. Men went mad from isolation. Suicide and self-harm were common. Even in the chapel, prisoners sat in separate enclosed boxes so they couldn't see each other. The psychological torture was deliberate. The ruins are now a tourist attraction, remarkably beautiful stone buildings in a scenic harbour. But it represents some of the cruelest punishment methods ever used in Australia. Fact 30. William Bligh was overthrown twice. William Bligh, famous as the captain of HMS Bounty overthrown in the 1789 mutiny, was appointed governor of New South Wales in 1805. He managed to get overthrown again, this time in Australia. Bligh was an excellent navigator but a terrible administrator with an authoritarian personality. He angered the New South Wales Corps, a military unit involved in illegal trading, especially rum trading. On January 26, 1808, exactly 20 years after the First Fleet arrived, officers arrested Bligh and removed him from office. This became the Rum Rebellion, though it was more about power than rum. Bligh was held prisoner for over a year before being sent back to Britain. The officers initially faced no consequences. Major George Johnston was eventually court-martialed, but received only light punishment. The Rum Rebellion was the only successful armed takeover of an Australian government. Fact 31. Convict women were forced into prostitution. Female convicts faced horrific conditions that male convicts didn't experience. Roughly 25,000 women were transported between 1788 and 1852, about 15% of all convicts. Many had been transported for minor property crimes, often stealing food or clothes. Upon arrival, they faced a system designed to exploit them sexually. Women were assigned as domestic servants to free settlers. The assignment system had no protections. Masters could treat them however they wanted. Sexual abuse was common and unpunished. Women who didn't receive assignments or were returned as troublesome ended up in female factories. These institutions supposedly were workhouses, but effectively functioned as prisons and forced brothels. The Cascades Female Factory in Tasmania held up to 1,000 women in appalling conditions. Female convicts were treated as commodities. Some were forced into prostitution. Others were coerced into relationships because the colony needed women. Marriage to a convict woman was encouraged as a way to reform her and create families. Female convict experiences were hidden in official histories for decades. Early Australian history focused on male convicts and administrators. Female experiences, including widespread sexual abuse, were ignored or minimised until recent decades. Fact 32. Aboriginal resistance included guerrilla warfare. Aboriginal Australians didn't passively accept British invasion. They fought back in hundreds of conflicts across the continent from 1788 through the early 1900s. Pemulwuy, a Bidjigal warrior, led resistance around Sydney from 1790 to 1802. He organised raids on British farms and evaded capture for years. British soldiers eventually shot him in 1802 and sent his severed head to Britain as a trophy. In Tasmania, the Black War from 1824 to 1831 was systematic conflict. Aboriginal warriors used guerrilla tactics, attacking isolated farms and avoiding armed soldiers. The colonial government responded with massacres. In Queensland, the Kalkadoon people fought from the 1860s to 1884. The conflict ended at the Battle of Battle Mountain in 1884, where Kalkadoon warriors armed with spears and clubs fought native police armed with rifles. Over 200 Kalkadoon warriors were killed. In Western Australia, Jandamara, a Bunuba warrior, led resistance in the 1890s. He'd worked for colonial police and knew their tactics, which he used against them. He was killed in 1897 but became a folk hero. Frontier warfare between Aboriginal people and colonists occurred across Australia for over a century. Aboriginal people fought to defend their land using every means available. Fact 33. The Queensland Native Police committed massacres. From 1848 to 1904, the Queensland colonial government operated the Native Police, a force made up of Aboriginal troopers commanded by white officers. Their official role was to maintain order on the frontier. Their actual role was to kill Aboriginal people. The Native Police were recruited from Aboriginal groups far from their home territories, so they had no connection to local Aboriginal people they were sent to fight. They were armed with rifles and carbines. They were given essentially unlimited authority to use violence. Massacres carried out by the Native Police were frequent and brutal. Entire camps would be surrounded at dawn and everyone shot, men, women, and children. Bodies were burned to hide evidence. Official reports would claim a few Aboriginal people were killed in self-defense, when actually dozens or hundreds had been massacred. The Cullen Laringo massacre in 1861, where Aboriginal people killed 19 settlers in retaliation for previous violence, led to reprisal massacres by Native police that killed potentially hundreds of Aboriginal people across Queensland. Exact numbers are unknown because the Native police deliberately didn't keep honest records. The Native police were finally disbanded in 1904 after decades of atrocities. Estimates of total Aboriginal people killed by the Native police range from hundreds to thousands, but accurate numbers are impossible because of deliberate concealment. It was state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing. Fact 34. Mile Creek Massacre led to the only hangings on June 10, 1838, at Mile Creek in New South Wales. A group of 11 stockmen and former convicts attacked a camp of Aboriginal people. They tied up at least 28 Aboriginal men, women, and children, led them away from the camp, and murdered them with swords and guns. They then burned the bodies to hide evidence of the massacre. What made Mile Creek different from countless other massacres was that it was witnessed and reported. Local landowner Frederick Foote discovered the massacre and reported it to authorities, despite pressure from other settlers to keep quiet. The colonial government actually prosecuted the killers, which was extraordinary. Frontier killings of Aboriginal people were common and almost never prosecuted. But Mile Creek was too blatant and too well documented to ignore. The first trial ended with acquittals. The all-white jury refused to convict white men for killing Aboriginal people, but the government persisted and retried 7 of the defendants. This time, they were convicted of murder. On December 18, 1838, 7 men were hanged for killing Aboriginal people. These were the first and last hangings for killing Aboriginal Australians in the 19th century. The executions were deeply unpopular among settlers, who thought the men shouldn't be punished for killing blacks. The Mile Creek Massacre and trials are remembered because they were exceptional. Justice was extremely rare. Most massacres went unreported, uninvestigated, and unpunished. The hanging sent a message that murdering Aboriginal people could theoretically be punished, but it didn't stop frontier violence. Fact 35. Gold rush miners included armed revolutionaries. The Victorian gold rushes in the 1850s attracted people from around the world, including European political refugees who'd fled after failed revolutions in 1848. Experienced revolutionaries ended up in the goldfields of Ballarat. When tensions exploded at Eureka in 1854, the rebel miners included men who'd fought in European revolutions. They knew how to organize militarily, build fortifications, and coordinate armed resistance. The Eureka Stockade wasn't just angry miners improvising. Some of them had actual military training and combat experience. Raffaello Carboni, an Italian revolutionary who'd participated in the Roman Republic of 1849, was at Eureka and later wrote a detailed first-hand account of the rebellion. Peter Lalore, the leader, had connections to Irish nationalist movements. Other miners had fought in the German revolutions or Polish uprisings against Russian rule. The colonial government was terrified these European radicals would spread revolutionary ideas beyond the goldfields. The British Empire had just spent years putting down revolutionary movements in Europe, and now they appeared in Australia, armed and ready to fight for democratic rights. After Eureka was crushed, the government was actually relieved that most of the foreign revolutionaries left Australia. They didn't want experienced revolutionaries staying permanently and potentially organising future rebellions. Fact 36. Australia's first railway was pulled by horses. Australia's first railway opened in 1854 in Melbourne, running from Flinders Street to Port Melbourne. It was pulled by horses, not steam engines. The railway company had ordered steam locomotives from Britain, but they hadn't arrived. Not wanting to delay the opening, they used horses to pull carriages. When steam locomotives arrived, they were poorly suited to Australian conditions. They'd been designed for British railways with gentle grades. Australian terrain was rougher, and tracks were built cheaply. Locomotives broke down constantly. Each Australian colony built railways to different gauges. New South Wales used standard gauge. Victoria used broad gauge. Queensland used narrow gauge. This meant trains couldn't run between colonies. The different gauges persisted for over a century. It wasn't until 1970 that a standardized rail line connected Sydney to Perth, allowing cross-continent travel without changing trains. Fact 37. Captain Moonlight was a bushranger and likely gay captain. Moonlight, real name Andrew George Scott, was a bushranger in the 1870s who robbed banks and homesteads in Victoria and New South Wales. He's also believed to have been in a homosexual relationship with his accomplice James Nesbitt, making them possibly one of Australia's first documented same-sex couples. Scott was a former church lay reader who turned to crime. The contradictions in his character were stark. He led a gang that committed robberies but also quoted scripture and claimed to be fighting injustice. In 1879, the gang was cornered at Wantabadgery Station in New South Wales. A shootout followed that lasted hours. James Nesbitt was killed during the siege. Scott was wounded and captured. At his trial, Scott's letters to Nesbitt were read in court. They were romantic in tone, expressing deep affection and devotion. Scott requested to be buried with Nesbitt. At his execution in 1880, his last words were reportedly about Nesbitt, asking to be reunited with him in death. The newspapers reported the trial salaciously, hinting at the relationship without stating it directly because homosexuality was criminal and essentially unmentionable in Victorian society. Scott became a sensational figure, a bushranger with a scandalous secret. Modern historians have recognised Scott and Nesbitt as likely one of Australia's first documented same-sex couples. Fact 38. The stolen generations continued into the 1970s. We covered the stolen generations earlier, but it's worth emphasising how recently this occurred. Aboriginal children were being forcibly removed from families into the 1970s, within living memory. This isn't ancient history. People alive today were stolen as children. Parents alive today had children taken from them. The trauma isn't a historical curiosity. It's immediate and ongoing. In some states, the policy officially ended in the early 1970s, when laws allowing removal without cause were repealed. In practice, Aboriginal children continued to be removed at disproportionate rates through child welfare systems that were biased against Aboriginal families. Even today, Aboriginal children are massively overrepresented in foster care and out-of-home care. About 37% of children in out-of-home care in Australia are Aboriginal, despite Aboriginal children being only 6% of all Australian children. The system that created the stolen generations officially ended, but its legacy continues. Fact 39. Australia invented the secret ballot. The secret ballot, where voters mark their choices in private rather than declaring them publicly, was invented in Australia. It's still called the Australian ballot in some countries. Before secret ballots, voting was public. You'd announce your vote publicly or hand a coloured ballot to an official, making your choice known to everyone present. This allowed intimidation, bribery, and coercion. Employers could pressure workers. Landlords could pressure tenants. Violence against voters was common. In the 1850s, the Australian colonies of Victoria and South Australia introduced secret ballots. Voters received identical blank ballot papers, marked them in private booths, and placed them in sealed boxes. No one could see how you voted. Your ballot was anonymous. The system spread rapidly because it worked. Britain adopted it in 1872. The United States gradually adopted secret ballots in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It became the international standard for democratic elections. Australia's contribution to democracy, the secret ballot, is less famous internationally than Australia's origins as a prison colony. But the secret ballot is one of the most important democratic innovations of the 19th century. Fact 40. Port Arthur became a massacre site again in 1996. Port Arthur, the former convict prison in Tasmania, became a popular tourist attraction after closing as a prison. On April 28, 1996, a gunman killed 35 people and wounded 23 others at Port Arthur in the worst mass shooting in Australian history. The shooter used semi-automatic rifles to kill tourists and staff at the Port Arthur historic site and nearby locations. The massacre shocked Australia. Mass shootings didn't happen in Australia. The massacre led directly to comprehensive gun law reforms. Prime Minister John Howard, a conservative who'd been in office for less than 2 months, led the push for gun control despite fierce opposition from gun owners and rural communities. The National Firearms Agreement was reached within weeks. It banned semi-automatic and automatic rifles and shotguns, introduced a mandatory gun buyback program, and tightened licensing requirements. Over 650,000 firearms were bought back from owners and destroyed. Gun ownership in Australia dropped significantly. The reforms were politically controversial, particularly in rural areas, but Howard pushed them through. Since 1996, Australia has had 0 mass shootings of comparable scale. Gun deaths in Australia dropped significantly after the reforms. The Port Arthur massacre led to Australia having some of the strictest gun laws in the developed world. Fact 41. Australia almost became a republic in 1999. In 1999, Australia held a referendum on whether to become a republic and replace the British monarch as head of state with an Australian president. The referendum failed, but the result was complicated. Polls showed most Australians supported becoming a republic in principle, but the referendum proposed a specific model where Parliament would elect the president, not direct popular election by voters. This split Republicans into 2 camps. Direct election Republicans voted no because they wanted a different model. Monarchists voted no because they wanted to keep the Queen. The yes vote was only 45%. The referendum failed. The result meant Australia kept the British monarch as head of state. Queen Elizabeth II remained Queen of Australia. When she died in 2022, her son automatically became King Charles III of Australia, despite most Australians having no connection to the British royal family. The Republican movement hasn't disappeared. Polls still show majority support for an Australian republic eventually, but no government has been willing to hold another referendum since 1999. Australia remains one of the few democracies that has a foreign monarch as its head of state, though the role is mostly ceremonial. Fact 42. Australia gave women the vote early. In 1894, South Australia became the second place in the world, after New Zealand, to grant women full voting rights, including the right to stand for Parliament. This was genuinely progressive for the era. Other Australian colonies and the federal government followed quickly. By 1902, white women in Australia had federal voting rights. This was decades ahead of Britain, which didn't give women full voting rights until 1928, and the United States, which granted it in 1920. The catch was that Aboriginal women, like Aboriginal men, were excluded from voting. They didn't get full voting rights in federal elections until 1962, 60 years later. So Australia was progressive on women's suffrage, but only for white women. The women's suffrage movement in Australia was driven by progressive social reformers who believed in equality, but it was also supported by some advocates of the White Australia policy who thought white women voters would support racial restrictions and help maintain white dominance. The early extension of voting rights to women is part of Australia's democratic history, but it's complicated by the simultaneous exclusion of Aboriginal people from the same rights. Fact 43. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy has existed since 1972 on January 26, 1972, Australia Day. 4 Aboriginal activists set up a beach umbrella on the lawn of Parliament House in Canberra and declared it the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. It was a protest about land rights and sovereignty. The choice of date was deliberate and provocative. January 26th celebrates the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788, the beginning of British colonisation. For Aboriginal people, it represents the beginning of dispossession, genocide, and ongoing oppression. The activists turned Australia's National Day into a day of Aboriginal protest. The government tried to remove the embassy multiple times. Police tore it down, protesters rebuilt it, the conflicts became violent, protesters and police clashed repeatedly. The embassy became a symbol of Aboriginal political resistance and the demand for land rights and sovereignty. The embassy still exists today, over 50 years later. It's one of the longest-running political protests in the world. It represents Aboriginal sovereignty and the ongoing demand for recognition of Aboriginal rights, land ownership, and self-determination. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is a permanent reminder that Aboriginal people never ceded sovereignty, never signed treaties giving up their land, and continue to resist colonisation. Fact 44. Cyclones are named alphabetically. Australia names tropical cyclones alphabetically, alternating between male and female names. This system started in 1964 to make tracking cyclones easier. Before 1964, cyclones were tracked by latitude and longitude coordinates, which was confusing when multiple cyclones formed simultaneously. The Bureau of Meteorology adopted a naming system inspired by American practice. Cyclone Tracy, which destroyed Darwin in 1974, was named Tracy simply because it was late in the alphabet for that cyclone season. If the timing had been slightly different, Darwin might have been destroyed by Cyclone Susan or Cyclone Victoria instead. Some names are retired after particularly destructive cyclones. Tracy was retired out of respect for the destruction it caused. So were Larry and Yazi after causing billions in damage in the 2000s and 2010s. The naming system makes cyclones easier to track and discuss in the media, especially when multiple cyclones form at the same time. Fact 45. Australia gave up its nuclear weapons program. After Britain tested nuclear weapons in Australia in the 1950s, Australia briefly pursued its own nuclear weapons program in the late 1950s and 1960s. Research was conducted at facilities including Lucas Heights near Sydney. The program never reached weapons production, but Australia definitely explored becoming a nuclear power. The motivation was fear of Indonesia and China, combined with doubt about whether American nuclear protection would reliably extend to Australia in a crisis. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Australia signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and abandoned nuclear weapons development. The decision was pragmatic. Developing nuclear weapons would have been extremely expensive, would have damaged relationships with neighbours, and wasn't necessary given Australia's alliance with the United States. Australia never built a nuclear weapon, but came closer than most people realise. The research facilities existed. The expertise was developed, the political will wavered and ultimately didn't materialise. Australia remains one of the few countries that seriously considered developing nuclear weapons, had the capability to do so, and chose not to. Fact 46. Prime Minister Bob Hawke held a beer drinking record. Bob Hawke, who was Prime Minister from 1983 to 1991, held the world speed record for beer drinking while he was a student at Oxford University in 1954. He drank 2.5 pints in 11 seconds. Hawke was a Rhodes Scholar studying at Oxford when he set the record. He later said it was a skill he was particularly proud of, which gives you insight into Australian political culture and Hawke's personality. The record was mentioned frequently during Hawke's political career. Far from being embarrassed, Hawke highlighted it. He claimed it gave him credibility with working-class voters who appreciated a leader who could drink beer like a regular person. Hawke won 4 consecutive elections as Prime Minister. Whether his beer drinking record contributed to electoral success is impossible to prove, but Hawke genuinely believed it didn't hurt. The fact that a Prime Minister held a world beer drinking record and considered it politically advantageous tells you something about Australian culture. Fact 47. Wittenoom was abandoned due to asbestos. Wittenoom, a town in Western Australia, was established in the 1940s to mine blue asbestos. At its peak in the 1950s, about 20,000 people lived there. The town is now abandoned and officially deleted from maps. It's Australia's worst industrial disaster. Blue asbestos is the most dangerous form of asbestos. Wittenoom residents were exposed to massive levels of asbestos dust daily. Miners worked without protection. Children played in tailings piles made entirely of asbestos waste. By the 1960s, miners and residents started dying of asbestos-related diseases. Asbestosis, mesothelioma, lung cancer. These diseases can take 20 to 50 years to develop. People who left in the 1950s were diagnosed decades later. The mine closed in 1966, but people continued living there for decades. The government tried to relocate everyone. By the 2000s, only a handful refused to leave. The government shut down all services, power, water, postal services, all discontinued. They removed the town from maps. Road signs were taken down. Over 2,000 people have died from asbestos diseases linked to Wittenoom. More will die because asbestos diseases can develop 40 or 50 years after exposure. Fact 48. Cane toads were an ecological disaster. In 1935, the Queensland government imported 102 cane toads from Hawaii to control cane beetles that were destroying sugarcane crops. It was one of the worst ecological decisions in Australian history. Cane toads don't actually eat many cane beetles. The beetles live in the upper parts of cane plants where cane toads can't reach them. The toads were essentially useless for their intended purpose. But cane toads are excellent at reproducing and spreading. Each female can lay up to 30,000 eggs twice per year. They have no natural predators in Australia. They're poisonous, killing native animals that try to eat them. The cane toad population exploded. They spread from Queensland across northern Australia, reaching Western Australia by 2010. Current estimates suggest over 200 million cane toads in Australia. Cane toads kill native predators that try to eat them. They compete with native species for food and habitat. They're considered one of Australia's worst invasive species. Efforts to control cane toads have all failed. Cane toads are now a permanent part of the Australian ecosystem, a living reminder of ecological ignorance in 1935. Fact 49. Sharks briefly killed more Australians than COVID. In 2020, the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia had remarkable success controlling the virus through strict lockdowns, border closures, and contact tracing. Total COVID deaths in 2020 were under 1,000 for the entire year. Meanwhile, several people were killed by shark attacks in Australian waters in 2020. For a brief period, sharks were statistically more dangerous to Australians than COVID-19, which became a darkly humorous talking point. This says more about Australia's effective pandemic response than about shark danger. Shark attacks are rare. Australia averages about 1 shark fatality per year, but the statistic became a cultural moment. Australia, the country internationally known for deadly animals, briefly had deadlier wildlife than a global pandemic, due to successful public health measures keeping COVID deaths extremely low. Of course, this changed in 2021 and 2022 when COVID deaths increased as restrictions eased. But for a few months in 2020, the sharks versus COVID comparison was technically accurate and perfectly captured Australia's bizarre relationship with dangerous wildlife. Fact 50. Australia has the most venomous creatures on Earth. Australia's reputation for deadly wildlife is well deserved. The country has more venomous creatures than anywhere else on the planet. All 10 of the world's most venomous snakes live in Australia. The inland taipan has the most toxic venom. One bite can kill 100 humans. Australia has the box jellyfish, the most venomous marine creature. The blue-ringed octopus carries enough venom to kill 26 adults. The Sydney funnel web spider can kill humans. Before anti-venom in 1981, 13 people died from bites. Even the platypus has venomous spurs causing excruciating pain lasting weeks. Despite all these deadly creatures, actual deaths are rare. Australia averages about 2 snake deaths per year. More people die from bee stings or horse riding accidents. The reputation exceeds the reality, but the wildlife genuinely is extraordinarily venomous. Fact 51. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. The Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral reef system, is dying from climate change and human activity. This is happening right now, in real time. The reef spans over 2,300 kilometers along the Queensland coast. It's visible from space. It contains over 400 types of coral and 1,500 species of fish. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's being destroyed. Mass coral bleaching occurred in 1998, 2002, 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022. The 2016 and 2017 events were catastrophic. Approximately 50% of the reef's coral died. The reef generates $6 billion annually for the Australian economy through tourism. It supports 64,000 jobs. Over 2 million people visit each year. But if current trends continue, most of the reef could be dead within decades. The Australian government's response has been inadequate. Australia remains one of the world's largest coal exporters, and coal is a major driver of climate change. The government approved a massive coal mine in Queensland, despite environmental concerns about its impact on the reef. Scientists are racing to develop intervention strategies: coral gardening, selective breeding of heat-resistant coral, cloud brightening to cool water temperatures. But these are desperate measures. Without significant action on climate change, the Great Barrier Reef will die. Fact 52. Rabbits nearly destroyed Australia. In 1859, Thomas Austin released 24 rabbits on his property in Victoria for hunting. Within decades, rabbits became the worst invasive species disaster in Australian history. Rabbits have no natural predators in Australia. They breed extraordinarily fast. One pair can produce 30 to 40 offspring per year. The population exploded. By 1926, less than 70 years after introduction, the rabbit population was estimated at 10 billion. 10 billion rabbits eating vegetation across Australia. They destroyed crops, competed with native animals, caused massive erosion by eating all ground cover, and fundamentally altered entire ecosystems. Farmers tried everything to control them. Shooting, poisoning, trapping. Nothing worked on a population of billions. The rabbits bred faster than they could be killed. In 1950, Australia introduced myxomatosis, a virus that kills rabbits. The population crashed from 600 million to 100 million. But rabbits developed resistance. In 1996, Australia released calicivirus. Again, it worked, then failed. The rabbit population today is around 200 million. They still cause massive agricultural damage, estimated at $200 million annually. Over 150 years after 24 rabbits were released for hunting, Australia is still fighting a rabbit plague. Fact 53. Uluru was closed to climbers in 2019. Uluru, also called Ayers Rock, is a massive sandstone formation in central Australia. It's sacred to the Anangu people, the traditional owners. For decades, tourists climbed it, despite Anangu requests not to. The Anangu have lived around Uluru for thousands of years. Climbing Uluru is deeply disrespectful, comparable to climbing on a church altar. But climbing became popular. Hundreds of thousands climbed over decades. The Ananga asked tourists not to. Many ignored this. Climbing was also dangerous. At least 35 people died attempting it, mostly from heart attacks or falls. In 2019, the park board voted to close the climb. The closure took effect October 26, 2019. The decision was controversial. Some tourists were angry, feeling they had a right to climb. Some rushed to climb before the closure, queuing for hours. The final weekend before closure saw thousands climbing, many disrespectfully celebrating or posing for photos. The Anangu traditional owners had waited decades for this. The closure was a victory for Indigenous rights and cultural respect. Tourists can still visit Uluru, walk around its base, and learn about its significance. They just can't climb on a sacred site anymore. Fact 54. Australia. Exported sand to Saudi Arabia. Yes, Australia exported sand to Saudi Arabia, a country that's mostly desert. This sounds like a joke. It happened. Saudi Arabia has plenty of sand, but most of it is the wrong type for construction. Desert sand is too fine and smooth. The grains are rounded by wind erosion. This sand doesn't bind well in concrete. Construction requires coarser sand, usually from riverbeds or beaches. The grains need to be angular to lock together in concrete. Saudi Arabia, despite being covered in sand, doesn't have enough of the right kind of sand for massive construction projects. Australia has extensive deposits of construction-grade sand. In the 2000s and 10s, Australia exported millions of tons of sand to the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, for construction projects. The sand export industry is worth hundreds of millions globally. Sand is the second most consumed natural resource after water. Australia has construction-grade sand, so Australia exports it, even to countries covered in the wrong kind. Fact 55. The stolen wages were never fully repaid. From the late 1800s to the 1970s, many Australian states passed laws allowing the government to control the wages of Aboriginal workers. The government claimed this was protective. In reality, it was theft. Aboriginal workers had wages paid to government trust accounts. The government was supposed to hold the money in trust. Instead, they stole it. Workers were often paid nothing while government kept their wages. Estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars in wages were stolen from Aboriginal workers over decades. The exact amount is unknown because records were deliberately incomplete or destroyed. In the 2000s, some states established compensation schemes for stolen wages, but the compensation was a fraction of what was owed. Queensland offered $2,000 to $4,000 to claimants. The actual stolen wages for a lifetime of work would be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many Aboriginal people who had wages stolen died before compensation was offered. Their descendants received nothing. The compensation schemes required proof, but many workers had no documentation because the government hadn't kept proper records. The stolen wages represent economic exploitation on top of all the other injustices. Aboriginal people worked their entire lives and had their wages stolen by the government. Most were never compensated. It's theft that was legal and remains largely unredressed. Fact 56. Gough Whitlam implemented free university. In 1974, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's Labor government abolished university tuition fees, making higher education free for all Australians. It was a genuinely radical policy. Before 1974, university was expensive. Free education opened universities to working-class students. Enrollment increased dramatically. The policy lasted nearly 15 years. In 1989, the Hawke Labor government reintroduced fees through the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, now called HECS Help. Students didn't pay up front, but incurred debts repaid through the tax system once they earned above a threshold. The current system is more generous than the pre-1974 system, but less generous than free education. Students graduate with significant debts. The average HECS debt is around $25,000. Some degrees result in debts over $100,000. The free university period from 1974 to 1989 is remembered nostalgically by those who benefited. It represented a brief moment when Australia treated higher education as a universal right rather than a commodity. Fact 57. Pine Gap is a US spy base in Central Australia. Near Alice Springs in Central Australia sits Pine Gap, officially the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. It's a spy base operated by the United States and Australia. It's one of the most important intelligence facilities in the world. Pine Gap was established in 1966. Officially, it's jointly operated by Australia and the US. In practice, the US controls it. The facility employs about 1,000 people, mostly Americans. Pine Gap intercepts satellite communications and signals intelligence from across the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. It tracks missile launches, monitors communications, and supports US military operations globally. Data from Pine Gap has been used in drone strikes and military targeting. The facility is extraordinarily secretive. What happens inside is classified. Employees sign strict non-disclosure agreements. The base is surrounded by security and restricted airspace. Journalists and outsiders are kept far away. Pine Gap has been controversial since its establishment. Peace activists have protested outside the facility for decades, opposing its role in US military operations and surveillance. Protesters have been arrested for trespassing. The facility's existence raises questions about Australian sovereignty. Australia hosts a foreign military intelligence base that operates largely outside Australian government control. Decisions about how Pine Gap's intelligence is used are made in Washington, not Canberra. Prime Minister Whitlam's concerns about Pine Gap contributed to the political crisis that led to his dismissal in 1975. He wanted more Australian control over the facility. The US wanted Whitlam removed. Whitlam was removed. Pine Gap remains operational and continues to be central to US intelligence and military operations in the Asia-Pacific. Fact 58. Vegemite was invented because of World War I. Vegemite, the thick brown spread Australians love and foreigners hate, was invented in 1922 because World War I disrupted Marmite imports from Britain. Before World War I, Australians who wanted a savoury yeast spread bought Marmite imported from Britain. The war disrupted shipping, making Marmite scarce and expensive. Food manufacturer Fred Walker hired chemist Cyril Callister to develop an Australian alternative. Callister created a spread made from yeast extract, a byproduct of beer brewing. The result was Vegemite, darker and slightly different in taste from Marmite. It was launched in 1923 but initially struggled. Australians were loyal to Marmite. The breakthrough came in the 1930s and 1940s, when Vegemite was included in Australian military rations during World War II. Soldiers became accustomed to it. After the war, Vegemite became associated with Australian identity. Vegemite is now a cultural icon. Most Australian children grow up eating it. It's rich in B vitamins. The taste is intensely salty and savoury, almost overwhelming to those not raised on it. Foreigners trying Vegemite typically hate it because they spread it thick like jam. The correct method is very thin on buttered toast. Fact 59. Advance Australia. Fair wasn't always the anthem. Australia's national anthem is Advance Australia Fair, but it wasn't always. Until 1984, the national anthem was God Save the Queen, the British anthem. God Save the Queen was Australia's anthem because Australia was part of the British Empire and then a Commonwealth realm with the British monarch as head of state. At official events, Australians stood for God Save the Queen, an anthem about the British monarchy. This became increasingly awkward as Australian national identity developed separately from Britain. Singing God Save the Queen at the Olympics while competing against Britain was confusing. In 1977, a plebiscite was held to choose a new anthem. The options were Advance Australia Fair, Waltzing Matilda, and Song of Australia, or Keep God Save the Queen. Advance Australia Fair won with 43% of the vote. It took until 1984 for Advance Australia Fair to be officially proclaimed as the national anthem. The lyrics to Advance Australia Fair are aggressively optimistic and vague. They mention rejoicing and advancing, but contain no specific references to Australian history or culture. Some Australians still think Waltzing Matilda should be the anthem. It's a song about a sheep thief who drowns himself to avoid arrest. Fact 60. Nauru was strip-mined to nothing. Nauru, a tiny island nation in the Pacific, was controlled by Australia from 1914 to 1968. During that time, Australia strip-mined the island for phosphate, destroying over 80% of its land area and leaving it an ecological wasteland. Nauru is one of the smallest countries on Earth, just 21 square kilometres. It was covered in phosphate deposits from thousands of years of bird droppings. Phosphate is valuable for fertiliser. Australia, New Zealand, and Britain formed a partnership to mine Nauru's phosphate. The mining was extraordinarily profitable. Between 1919 and 1968, over 34 million tonnes of phosphate were extracted and shipped to Australia to fertilise farmland. The mining destroyed Nauru. The entire interior of the island was dug up, leaving a moonscape of limestone pillars and mining pits. Only a narrow coastal strip remained habitable. The Nauruan people received minimal benefits from the mining. Australia got cheap fertiliser, Nauru got an uninhabitable wasteland. When Nauru gained independence in 1968, the phosphate was nearly exhausted. Today, Nauru is one of the poorest countries in the Pacific. Nauru now hosts an Australian immigration detention centre. Australia destroyed the island through mining and now pays to use it as a prison for refugees. Fact 61. The dismissal created a constitutional crisis. The dismissal of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam on November 11, 1975, was the most dramatic political event in modern Australian history. The Governor-General, the Queen's representative, fired the elected Prime Minister. Whitlam's government was elected in 1972. In 1975, the opposition controlled the Senate and blocked Whitlam's budget. Whitlam refused to resign. Governor-General Sir John Kerr intervened. On November 11, 1975, Kerr summoned Whitlam to Government House. Whitlam thought they were discussing the crisis. Instead, Kerr dismissed him and appointed opposition leader Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister. Fraser immediately passed the budget through Parliament and called an election. Thousands of people protested outside Parliament House. Whitlam gave a speech from the Parliament House steps, ending with the famous line, "Well, may we say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General." Fraser won the subsequent election. The dismissal was constitutionally legal but politically explosive. Many Australians still view it as a constitutional coup. Evidence suggests pressure from the US and conservative Australian officials played a role. Fact 62. Australia briefly banned Mortal Kombat. In 1993, Australia banned the video game Mortal Kombat because it was too violent. The game featured graphic violence and finishing moves called fatalities. Australia's classification system at the time had no R18+ category for video games. Games could only be rated up to MA15+. Anything deemed too violent for 15-year-olds was refused classification, effectively banning it. Mortal Kombat was refused classification. You couldn't legally sell it in Australia. Gamers found ways around the ban. They imported copies from overseas or bought censored versions released later. The lack of an R18 plus rating for video games persisted for decades. Australia banned many games that were legal elsewhere. In 2013, Australia finally introduced an R18 plus rating for video games. Adults could legally buy violent games. The banning of Mortal Kombat became a symbol of Australia's overly restrictive classification system. Fact 63. Aboriginal people weren't allowed in swimming pools. Through the mid-20th century, many public swimming pools in Australia banned Aboriginal people or allowed them only on specific days before the pool was drained and refilled. This was government-sanctioned racial segregation. In some towns, Aboriginal people could use the pool on Fridays. The pool was then drained Friday night and refilled Saturday. The message: Aboriginal people were considered dirty. In other places, Aboriginal people were banned entirely. Signs reading "No Aboriginals" were posted. Aboriginal children watched white children swim while being excluded. The pool restrictions persisted into the 1960s and in some places into the 1970s. The 1967 referendum, which changed the constitution to count Aboriginal people in the census, didn't immediately end practical discrimination. The freedom rides of 1965, inspired by American civil rights movements, protested segregation in New South Wales country towns. University students rode buses to towns like Moree and Walgett, confronting pool managers who banned Aboriginal children. Gradually, explicit racial bans at pools were removed. But the fact that Aboriginal people were banned from public swimming pools within living memory remains shameful. Fact 64. Waltzing Matilda is about stealing a sheep. Waltzing Matilda, Australia's unofficial national anthem, is about a homeless man who steals a sheep, is chased by police, and drowns himself rather than be arrested. The lyrics are in Australian slang that requires translation. A swagman is a homeless traveller who carries their belongings in a swag, a bedroll. Waltzing Matilda means travelling with your swag. A billabong is a watering hole. A jumbuck is a sheep. The swagman camps by a billabong. A jumbuck comes to drink. The swagman grabs it, kills it, and puts it in his tucker bag. He's boiling water to cook the stolen sheep when a squatter, a landowner, arrives on horseback with 3 troopers, police. The swagman, facing arrest for sheep theft, jumps into the billabong and drowns. This song is sung at sporting events, schools, and national ceremonies. It's beloved by Australians, and it's about a sheep thief who commits suicide to avoid police. The song reflects Australian attitudes toward authority. The swagman is portrayed sympathetically. He's poor and hungry. The landowner and police are the villains. Breaking the law to survive is acceptable. Dying free is better than being arrested. Waltzing Matilda captures something essential about Australian identity that Advance Australia Fair doesn't. It's about the underdog, the outsider, defying authority. Fact 65. Harold Holt had a swimming pool named after him. After Prime Minister Harold Holt disappeared while swimming in 1967, the government decided to honour him by naming a swimming pool after him. Yes, they named a swimming pool after a man who drowned. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre opened in Melbourne in 1969. It's a large public swimming facility with pools and diving boards. The irony of naming a swimming pool after someone who drowned swimming is apparently lost on no one except the people who approved the name. It's become internationally famous as an example of unintentional dark humour. Australians generally find it funny rather than offensive. Dark humour is part of Australian culture. The pool is still operating today, over 50 years later. The name has never been changed. Fact 66. The Sydney Harbour Bridge took 9 years to build. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, opened in 1932, took 9 years to build. It required over 52,000 tons of steel. The arch span is 503 meters. Construction was dangerous. 16 workers died during construction from falls and crushing. Workers operated at extreme heights without modern safety equipment. The bridge opened on March 19, 1932. Premier Jack Lang was scheduled to cut the ribbon. Before Lang could cut it, Francis de Groot, a member of a right-wing group, rode up on a horse and slashed the ribbon with his sword. De Groot was immediately arrested. The ribbon was hastily retied, and Lang cut it officially minutes later. The bridge opening was supposed to be a moment of pride, but became a political spectacle. The bridge has become one of the most recognizable structures in the world. Tourists climb it. Fireworks explode over it on New Year's Eve. Fact 67. Gallipoli is sacred to Australia. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915, during World War I, is remembered in Australia with an intensity that borders on religious reverence. Anzac Day, April 25th, has become Australia's most important national day. The campaign was a disaster. Anzac forces landed at Gallipoli as part of a British plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The plan failed. Turkish forces held high ground. Anzacs were pinned on narrow beaches. After 8 months, Allied forces evacuated. Over 8,000 Australians died. The campaign achieved nothing. Despite being a military defeat, Gallipoli became foundational to Australian national identity. The narrative claims that Australia became a nation at Gallipoli, that the courage and sacrifice of the Anzacs defined Australian character. Anzac Day is observed with dawn services across Australia. Thousands of Australians travel to Gallipoli each year for commemorations. The Gallipoli mythology has been criticised for glorifying a pointless military disaster. But for many Australians, Gallipoli remains sacred. Fact 68. Simpson and his donkey is a wartime legend. John Simpson Kirkpatrick, known as Simpson, was a stretcher bearer at Gallipoli who used a donkey to carry wounded soldiers. He became one of Australia's most famous war heroes despite being British. Simpson was born in England and worked as a merchant seaman before enlisting in the Australian Army. At Gallipoli, Simpson found a donkey and began using it to transport wounded men. He worked alone, repeatedly going into no man's land under fire to rescue soldiers. For 24 days, Simpson and his donkey carried wounded men. On May 19, 1915, Simpson was killed by machine gun fire while carrying a wounded soldier. He was 22 years old. He'd saved dozens, possibly hundreds of lives in 24 days. The story of Simpson and his donkey became legendary. He represented courage, selflessness, and mateship. Statues and memorials depict Simpson with his donkey. The irony is that Simpson was British, not Australian, but he became an Australian hero because he embodied the Anzac values of courage and service. Fact 69. Manus and Nauru are Australia's offshore prisons. Since 2012, Australia has operated immigration detention centres on Manus Island, in Papua New Guinea, and on Nauru. Asylum seekers who arrive by boat are sent to these offshore processing centres and detained indefinitely. The policy, called offshore processing, was designed to deter asylum seekers from attempting to reach Australia by boat. Anyone arriving by boat is sent to Manus or Nauru and told they will never be settled in Australia, even if found to be genuine refugees. Conditions in the detention centres have been condemned by human rights organisations as inhumane. Detainees live in prison-like conditions with inadequate healthcare, education and safety. Violence, sexual abuse and self-harm are common. Several people have died in detention on Manus and Nauru. Asylum seekers have committed suicide. Others have died from inadequate medical care. The detention centres cost billions of dollars. Australia pays Papua New Guinea and Nauru to host the facilities. The cost per detainee is far higher than resettling refugees in Australia would be. Offshore detention represents Australia exporting its refugee obligations to poor Pacific nations, detaining people indefinitely in conditions that would be illegal in Australia. Fact 70. Peter Allen wrote, "I still call Australia home. The song I Still Call Australia Home is an unofficial anthem, played at airports and used in tourism advertising. It was written by Peter Allen, a gay Australian performer, in 1980. Peter Allen grew up in country Australia, moved to Sydney, and then built a career in the United States. He wrote Arthur's Theme and I Honestly Love You. He was married briefly to Liza Minnelli, though he was openly gay. The song's about travelling the world, but retaining a connection to Australia. It became immensely popular in Australia. Qantas used it in advertising for decades. Peter Allen died of AIDS-related illness in 1992. His sexuality and cause of death were initially downplayed, reflecting homophobia of the era. The irony is that one of Australia's most patriotic songs was written by a gay performer who spent most of his adult life overseas, but it's been adopted as an expression of national pride. Fact 71. Cyclone Tracy evacuees were flown out on Christmas after Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin on Christmas Day, 1974. The largest peacetime airlift in Australian history evacuated over 25,000 people. Many were flown out still wearing what they had worn to sleep on Christmas Eve. The airlift began on December 26th. Military and civilian aircraft flew continuously for a week, shuttling evacuees to cities across Australia. Families arrived with nothing. They'd lost homes, possessions, everything. Many were separated from family members in the chaos. Children were evacuated without parents. The evacuation was necessary. Darwin had no power, water, or sewerage. Evacuees were received by family, friends, or temporary accommodation arranged by state governments. Many never returned to Darwin. The Christmas timing made the disaster more traumatic. Families had been celebrating Christmas when the cyclone hit. Children lost Christmas presents along with everything else. The airlift demonstrated impressive logistical capacity, but the human cost was enormous. Thousands of people lost their homes and community on Christmas. Fact 72. The White Australia policy ended in 1973. But racism didn't. The White Australia policy officially ended in 1973, when the Whitlam government removed racial criteria from immigration law. But changing laws didn't immediately change attitudes or practices. Even after 1973, racism in immigration policy continued in subtle forms. Vietnamese refugees arrived in large numbers in the late 1970s and 1980s after the Vietnam War. They faced significant racism. Chinese and other Asian immigrants increased through the 1980s and 1990s. Gradually, Australian society became more multicultural, but racism didn't disappear. It evolved. The debate about immigration continues to have racial undertones. Rhetoric about boat people and illegal immigrants often targets non-white asylum seekers. The White Australia policy ended legally in 1973. The attitudes that created it persisted for decades and haven't entirely disappeared. Fact 73. Phar Lap died mysteriously in America. Phar Lap was Australia's greatest racehorse, winning 37 of 51 races in the early 1930s during the Great Depression. He became a national hero. Then he died mysteriously in California in 1932. Phar Lap was born in New Zealand but trained in Australia. He won the Melbourne Cup in 1930. He was enormous, with a massive heart weighing 6.2 kilograms. During the Depression, Phar Lap's victories lifted public morale. In 1932, his owners took him to America. Phar Lap won the Agua Caliente handicap in Mexico, then returned to California. On April 5, 1932, Phar Lap suddenly became ill. He died within hours. Conspiracy theories immediately spread. Some believed American gangsters poisoned him. In 2008, Australian researchers analyzed Phar Lap's preserved stomach. They found high levels of arsenic, confirming poisoning. The source remains unknown. Phar Lap's death devastated Australians. His hide is displayed at the Melbourne Museum. His skeleton is in New Zealand. His heart is in Canberra. Even in death, Phar Lap was divided between nations claiming him. Fact 74. The Indigenous flag was designed in 1971. The Aboriginal flag, designed in 1971 by Harold Thomas, has become an internationally recognized symbol. The design: black representing Aboriginal people, red representing the earth, yellow representing the sun. Thomas designed it for the National Aborigines Day March in 1971. It became a symbol of Aboriginal rights and sovereignty. In 1995, the Australian government officially recognised the Aboriginal flag as an official flag of Australia. But there was a complication. Harold Thomas retained copyright of the design. In the 2000s, Thomas licensed the flag design exclusively to a company that demanded payment from anyone using the flag commercially. Aboriginal organisations were told they had to pay to use their own flag on merchandise. This created outrage. The flag belonged to Aboriginal people culturally, but legally one man owned it and one company controlled commercial use. In 2022, the Australian government purchased the copyright from Harold Thomas for $20 million, making the flag freely available for public use. The flag finally belonged to everyone. The Aboriginal flag is now flown at government buildings, sporting events, and protests. It represents Aboriginal pride, resistance, and ongoing sovereignty. The black, red, and yellow flag is one of the most recognisable symbols of Indigenous Australia. Fact 75. The Aboriginal land rights movement was a long fight. The fight for Aboriginal land rights didn't succeed quickly. It took decades of activism, court cases, and political pressure. The first major victory was the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in 1976 in the Northern Territory. The Mabo decision in 1992 was transformative. Eddie Mabo challenged terra nullius. The High Court ruled in his favour, overturning terra nullius and recognising Aboriginal land ownership. In 1993, the Keating government passed the Native Title Act, establishing a process for Aboriginal people to claim native title over Crown land. But the process is extremely difficult. Claimants must prove continuous connection to the land since before colonisation, which is nearly impossible given forced removals, dispossession, and the stolen generations. The burden of proof is enormous. By 2024, only about 40% of Australia's landmass was under native title, much of it in remote areas with little economic value. Urban land and valuable agricultural land remained almost entirely outside native title claims. The land rights movement achieved legal recognition but limited practical return of land. Aboriginal people still fight for land rights today. Fact 76. Crocodile Dundee was Australia's biggest cultural export in 1986. A low-budget Australian film called Crocodile Dundee became an international phenomenon. It made over $328 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 1986. The film starred Paul Hogan as Mick Dundee, an Australian crocodile hunter in New York. The character embodied every Australian stereotype. Crocodile Dundee became Australia's cultural calling card, boosting tourism significantly. But it presented a fantasy version of Australia, ignoring Aboriginal people and presenting a white Outback identity that excluded most Australians. The film's success was both good and bad for Australia. It increased international awareness and tourism. but it also created stereotypes that Australians have spent decades trying to overcome. Not every Australian wrestles crocodiles or carries a massive knife. Paul Hogan, the star, became internationally famous. He later had tax problems with the Australian government, which is very Australian in a different way than Crocodile Dundee suggested. Fact 77. Australia controls almost 40% of Antarctica. Australia claims 42% of Antarctica, roughly 5.9 million square kilometres. This is the largest territorial claim on the continent. The claim is based on Douglas Mawson's expeditions in the early 20th century. The Antarctic Treaty in 1961 froze all territorial claims. Australia's claim isn't universally recognised. Australia maintains 3 permanent research stations in Antarctica: Casey, Davis, and Mawson. Australia also operates a 4th station on Macquarie Island, which is technically sub-Antarctic. The Australian Antarctic Program conducts scientific research and monitors environmental changes. Australian scientists study climate change, wildlife, and geology. Australia takes its Antarctic role seriously, spending hundreds of millions annually on Antarctic operations. The Antarctic Treaty prevents military activity and resource extraction. If the treaty ever collapses, Australia's claim to 42% of Antarctica would become extremely valuable. The continent contains significant mineral and oil reserves, currently protected but potentially accessible if international agreements change. Fact 78. The Sydney to Hobart yacht race killed 6 people in 1998. The Sydney to Hobart yacht race is an annual sailing competition starting on December 26th. The 1998 race became a disaster when a severe storm hit the fleet. The race began with 115 boats. A severe storm hit with waves up to 15 meters. Boats were damaged and sunk. 55 sailors were rescued from the water. 6 sailors died, 5 boats sank, 7 sailors were seriously injured. Of the 115 boats that started, only 44 finished the race. The disaster led to major changes in yacht race safety regulations. Weather forecasting improved dramatically. Emergency equipment requirements were strengthened. Crew training became mandatory. The race now has stricter qualification requirements and better communication systems. Satellite phones and GPS tracking became standard equipment. The Sydney to Hobart race continues to this day. It's considered one of the most challenging yacht races in the world. The 1998 race remains the worst disaster in the race's history. Fact 79. Kylie Minogue and Iggy Azalea are both Australian. Australia has produced numerous internationally successful musicians, though many people don't realise they're Australian. Kylie Minogue became an international pop star in the late 1980s, selling over 80 million records. Iggy Azalea moved to the US as a teenager. Many assume she's American. Other Australian musicians who are internationally successful but often not recognised as Australian include Keith Urban, a country music star who moved to the United States and married Nicole Kidman. The Bee Gees, though born in England, grew up in Australia and considered themselves Australian. AC/DC is Australian, formed in Sydney in 1973, though many people assume they're American or British. INXS was Australian, Men at Work, Sia, Tame Impala, all Australian. Australia has a disproportionately successful music industry for its population size. The country of 26 million people produces international stars regularly. Australian musicians often move to the United States or United Kingdom for larger markets, which is why many people don't realise they're Australian. Fact 80. Pavlova is contested between Australia and New Zealand. Pavlova, a meringue-based dessert with a crispy exterior and soft interior, topped with whipped cream and fruit, is claimed by both Australia and New Zealand as their national dessert. The dish was created in the 1920s, named after Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova, who toured Australia and New Zealand. Both countries claim to have invented it. New Zealand claims a Wellington hotel chef created it. Australia claims a Perth hotel chef created it. The debate is genuinely contentious. Australians and New Zealanders argue about pavlova ownership with surprising passion. Research suggests Australia has the earlier documented recipe, appearing in cookbooks in the 1920s. But New Zealand disputes this, claiming their recipe came first. Academic papers have been written about pavlova origins. In practical terms, both countries make and eat pavlova regularly. It's a traditional Christmas dessert in both nations. The recipe is the same. The only difference is which country claims to have invented it. The pavlova dispute is representative of Australia-New Zealand relations generally. The countries are close allies with shared history and culture. They compete intensely in sports. They argue about cultural ownership. It's a sibling relationship with all the rivalry and affection that implies. Russell Crowe, the actor, causes similar disputes. He was born in New Zealand but built his career in Australia. Both countries claim him when he's successful and disown him when he's controversial. Fact 81. Australia's worst industrial accident killed 75 miners. On February 18th, 1902, an explosion at the Mount Kembla coal mine near Wollongong killed 96 men and boys. It remains Australia's worst mining disaster. The explosion was caused by methane gas igniting. The mine had inadequate ventilation. Men and boys, some as young as 14, died from the blast. The disaster devastated the local community. Many families lost multiple members. An inquiry found the mine operators negligent. Ventilation was inadequate. Safety procedures weren't followed, but prosecutions were limited and penalties were minor. The mining company faced no serious consequences. Mining in Australia was extremely dangerous in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Safety regulations were minimal or unenforced. Workers had little power to demand safer conditions. Mining disasters were common, though Mount Kembla was the worst. Modern mining safety regulations resulted from disasters like Mount Kembla. Australian mines now have strict safety requirements, mandatory ventilation standards, and worker protections, but it took many deaths to achieve these protections. Fact 82. Qantas is the world's third oldest airline. Qantas, Australia's national airline, was founded in 1920 in Winton, Queensland. Only KLM and Avianca are older. The name Qantas stands for Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services. Qantas started flying mail in rural Queensland. By the 1930s, it flew internationally. The airline became famous for long-haul flights. Qantas became government-owned in 1947, privatised in 1993. Qantas has an exceptional safety record. The airline has never had a fatal jet aircraft accident since the jet era began. This safety record is a source of enormous pride for the airline and for Australians. The airline was featured in the 1988 film Rain Man, where Dustin Hoffman's character insisted on flying Qantas because Qantas never crashed. This line became famous and reinforced the airline's safety reputation. The airline faces competition from Middle Eastern and Asian carriers on international routes. Domestic competition from Virgin Australia has increased, but Qantas remains Australia's largest and most iconic airline, the flying kangaroo symbol recognised worldwide. Fact 83. Aboriginal Australians resisted for over 100 years. Aboriginal resistance to British colonisation lasted from 1788 until the early 1900s. This was over 100 years of continuous resistance, though the conflicts were geographically dispersed. The resistance took many forms: military resistance, guerrilla warfare, non-violent resistance, cultural resistance. Aboriginal warriors fought with spears against firearms, using knowledge of terrain to sustain resistance for decades. In Tasmania, the Black War lasted from 1824 to 1831. In Queensland, frontier warfare continued into the early 1900s. In Western Australia, resistance persisted through the 1920s in remote areas. The resistance ultimately failed militarily. Aboriginal people couldn't defeat the technological and numerical superiority of European colonizers. But the resistance was significant. Aboriginal people fought to defend their land and way of life for over a century. The resistance is often minimized or ignored in Australian history. The narrative frequently presents colonization as peaceful or inevitable. In reality, Aboriginal people fought colonization actively and sustained resistance across the continent for generations. Fact 84. Lamingtons are named after a governor. Lamingtons, small sponge cakes coated in chocolate and rolled in coconut, are a classic Australian dessert. They're named after Lord Lamington, Governor of Queensland from 1896 to 1901. Lord Lamington apparently hated the cakes, calling them those bloody poofy woolly biscuits. Despite this, they bear his name. Lamingtons are ubiquitous in Australia. They're sold in bakeries and supermarkets. Schools hold Lamington drives, selling homemade Lamingtons to raise money. The cakes are simple, cheap to make, and nostalgic. Like pavlova, New Zealand also claims Lamingtons. The dispute is less contentious than pavlova, possibly because Lamingtons are less prestigious. Both countries make and eat them regularly. Lamingtons represent Australian baking culture. Simple, practical, not fancy, but beloved nonetheless. Fact 85. The body line. Cricket series nearly broke relations with England. In 1932 and 1933, England toured Australia for a cricket series. The English team employed bodyline, deliberately bowling at batsmen's bodies. The tactic neutralised Don Bradman but injured players. Australian wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield had his skull fractured. Australian crowds were furious. The cricket board complained about unsportsmanlike behaviour. The British press and politicians responded with outrage. The dispute escalated beyond cricket. The Australian government became involved. Relations between Australia and Britain became strained over a cricket series. England won the series. Bodyline was effective, but the controversy led to rule changes banning the tactic. The series damaged Australian-British relations and became a defining moment in Australian sports history. The Bodyline series is remembered as a moment when Australia stood up to Britain, refusing to accept unfair treatment even in sport. It's taught in Australian schools as part of national identity formation. Cricket stopped being just a game and became a matter of national pride and independence. Fact 86. Melbourne was almost the national capital. When Australia federated in 1901, Sydney and Melbourne both wanted to be capital. The compromise was building a new capital between them. Melbourne served as temporary capital from 1901 to 1927. Canberra was selected as the site for the new capital in 1908. American architect Walter Burley Griffin won the design competition. Construction began slowly. World War I delayed building. Parliament finally moved to Canberra in 1927. Melbourne had been the capital for 26 years. Many government departments didn't fully relocate until the 1950s. Canberra is often criticised as boring and artificial. It was designed as a capital, not grown organically. The city exists because Sydney and Melbourne couldn't agree. It's a compromise that satisfied neither city. The Melbourne-Sydney rivalry persists. Sports, culture, lifestyle, everything's competitive. Canberra sits between them, neutral and largely ignored by both. Fact 87. The Stolen Generations. Apology happened in 2008. On February 13, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal apology to the stolen generations in Parliament. It was a significant moment in Australian history. The apology came after decades of campaigning by Aboriginal people and advocacy groups. Previous Prime Minister John Howard had refused to apologise, arguing current generations shouldn't apologise for past actions. Rudd's apology said sorry for the laws and policies that inflicted grief and loss on Aboriginal people. The apology was televised nationally. Thousands gathered to watch. Many felt it was important but insufficient without compensation. The apology didn't include compensation. Stolen Generations members received no financial redress for being forcibly removed from families and suffering abuse. The government argued acknowledgement was important, but compensation would be too expensive and legally complex. The 2008 apology was symbolically important. It officially acknowledged the harm done. But without compensation or systemic change to address ongoing Indigenous disadvantage, the apology's practical impact was limited. Fact 88. Drop bears are a national joke. Drop bears are a fictional Australian animal used to scare tourists. Australians tell foreigners that drop bears are carnivorous koalas that drop from trees to attack people. Australia already has so many deadly creatures that inventing another is believable. Australians commit to the joke, describing drop bear behaviour in detail. The Australian Museum has a satirical webpage about them. Drop bears represent Australian humour, dry, sarcastic and committed to the bit. Australians enjoy the joke of making foreigners believe in a fictional killer koala. It's harmless fun that plays on Australia's reputation for dangerous wildlife. The drop bear joke also reveals Australian attitudes toward their deadly wildlife. Australians are so accustomed to venomous creatures that they can joke about inventing more. Fact 89. Tim Tams are impossible to eat. Just one. Tim Tams are chocolate biscuits. 2 chocolate malted biscuits with chocolate cream filling coated in chocolate. They're manufactured by Arnott's and are culturally significant in Australia. Australians buy over 45 million packets annually. The Tim Tam Slam ritual involves using the biscuit as a straw for hot drinks. Tim Tams come in multiple flavours. Saying you'll eat just one Tim Tam is a lie Australians tell themselves. The biscuits are designed to be eaten in multiples. One packet contains 11 biscuits, which seems random but ensures you can't evenly share them. Tim Tams represent Australian food culture. Not fancy, very sweet, somewhat addictive, and consumed in quantities that health professionals would discourage. Fact 90. The Ashes urn contains burned cricket bails. The Ashes is a cricket series between Australia and England, one of the oldest sporting rivalries. The name comes from a satirical obituary published in 1882. Australia defeated England at the Oval in London in 1882. It was England's first loss to Australia on English soil. A British newspaper published a mock obituary stating that English cricket had died and the body would be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia. The following English tour to Australia became about winning back the Ashes. The English captain was presented with a small urn containing the ashes of burned cricket bails by a group of Melbourne women. The urn is tiny, about 15 centimetres tall, made of terracotta. It's extremely fragile and considered too delicate to move. It's permanently housed in the museum at Lord's Cricket Ground in London, and never travels, even when Australia wins the series. Winners receive a Waterford crystal replica instead of the actual urn. The Ashes series is intensely competitive. Australia and England play 5-match series every 2 years approximately, alternating between countries. Winning the Ashes is more important than almost any other cricket achievement for both countries. The rivalry is over 140 years old. It's steeped in history, tradition, and mutual animosity that's mostly sporting but occasionally genuine. The Bodyline series was part of Ashes history. So were many other controversies, dramatic finishes, and legendary performances. Fact 91. Aboriginals were classified under Flora and Fauna Act. This is commonly stated but historically inaccurate. Aboriginal people were never legally classified as flora and fauna in Australian law. The myth originates from Aboriginal people not being counted in the census until 1967. In reality, they were always legally recognised as people but were excluded from citizenship rights until the mid-20th century. The flora and fauna myth persists because it captures the essence of how Aboriginal people were treated, even if it's not technically accurate. Aboriginal people were denied basic rights, forcibly removed from land, and treated as less than human by laws and policies. The myth has been repeatedly debunked by historians and legal scholars, but it continues to circulate because it resonates emotionally with the reality of Aboriginal treatment. Fact 92. Australia has more than 10,000 beaches. Australia has approximately 10,685 beaches along its coastline. That's more beaches than any other country. The Australian coastline is 59,736 kilometres long. Bondi Beach attracts millions. Many remote beaches have never had human visitors. Australian beach culture is central to national identity. Swimming, surfing, beach cricket, barbecues, all part of the Australian lifestyle. Surf Lifesaving is a massive volunteer organisation with clubs at beaches nationwide. The beach is where Australians go in summer. Christmas Day at the beach is traditional for many families. Beach safety is taught in schools. Children learn to swim early and learn about rips, currents, and marine dangers. With 10,000 beaches, Australians are never far from the coast. Over 85% of the population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. The beach is Australia's backyard. Fact 93. The Great Australian Bight has never been fully explored. The Great Australian Bight is a large oceanic bight on Australia's southern coast. It's one of the most remote marine environments on Earth. The bight is huge, roughly 1,160 kilometres wide. The waters are deep, reaching depths over 5,000 metres. The continental shelf drops off steeply, creating underwater cliffs and canyons. The seafloor topography is dramatic and largely unmapped. The area is extraordinarily rich in marine life. Southern right whales migrate to the bight to breed. Great white sharks hunt there. Numerous fish and marine species live in the deep waters. The bight has never been fully explored. The depths are too great and the area too remote. Scientists have conducted limited research, but much of the bight's ecosystem remains unknown. Oil and gas companies have sought permission to drill in the bight. Environmental groups have opposed this fiercely, arguing an oil spill would be catastrophic in such a remote and pristine environment. The proposals have been rejected or withdrawn after public campaigns. The Great Australian Bight represents one of the last unexplored frontiers on Earth. It's in Australian waters, but remains largely mysterious. Fact 94. Rupert Murdoch is Australian? Rupert Murdoch, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, was born in Melbourne in 1931. He built a global media empire including News Corporation and 21st Century Fox. Murdoch inherited an Adelaide newspaper from his father in 1952. He expanded aggressively, buying newspapers across Australia throughout the 1950s and 1960s, then moved to Britain in the 1960s. He purchased The Sun and turned it into a tabloid empire. He bought The Times and The Sunday Times. In the United States, he created the Fox Broadcasting Company and founded Fox News in 1996, which became enormously influential in American politics. In 1985, Murdoch became an American citizen to comply with U.S. laws, requiring American ownership of television stations. He gave up his Australian citizenship. Legally, Murdoch is American. Culturally and historically, he's Australian. Murdoch's media properties have enormous political influence. His newspapers and television networks shape political debates in Australia, Britain, and the United States. Critics accuse Murdoch of using his media empire to push conservative politics and support politicians who benefit his business interests. In Australia, Murdoch's News Corp owns approximately 70% of newspaper circulation. This concentration gives Murdoch significant influence over Australian politics and public opinion. Australians have complicated feelings about Murdoch. He's one of Australia's most successful business figures internationally. But his political influence, media monopoly, and abandonment of Australian citizenship create resentment. Fact 95. Kangaroo meat is sold in supermarkets. Kangaroos are Australia's national symbol, featured on the coat of arms and currency. They're also eaten. Kangaroo meat is sold in Australian supermarkets, usually in the fresh meat section alongside beef and lamb. It's lean, very high in protein, low in fat, and considered environmentally sustainable. Kangaroos are wild harvested, not farmed. Licensed professional shooters harvest kangaroos at night in rural areas under strict quotas. The meat is processed in licensed facilities. Eating kangaroo is controversial. Some Australians refuse to eat the national symbol. Others argue kangaroos are sustainably harvested and environmentally better than cattle or sheep. Kangaroos produce less methane and require no additional land clearing. Kangaroo meat is exported to over 55 countries. It's marketed as exotic game meat. Consumption is higher overseas than in Australia. where many people are squeamish about eating kangaroos. The kangaroo industry is regulated. Population surveys determine sustainable harvest numbers. Only certain species can be harvested. The industry argues its conservation through use, managing kangaroo populations sustainably. Animal welfare groups oppose kangaroo harvesting, arguing the practice is cruel and poorly regulated. The debate continues between conservation groups, the kangaroo industry, and animal rights activists. For many Australians, the idea of eating kangaroo remains uncomfortable. The animals are too iconic, too Australian to eat. Fact 96. Bluey is Australia's biggest kids' TV export. Bluey, an animated children's show about a blue heeler dog family, premiered in Australia in 2018. It became a global phenomenon, particularly in the United States. The show depicts Bluey and her family playing imaginative games. Each episode is 7 minutes. Bluey became massively popular, streaming on Disney Plus in over 60 countries. American parents became obsessed, claiming it taught better parenting. Bluey's success is significant for Australian children's television. The show is authentically Australian, set in Brisbane, featuring Australian voices, culture, and animals. It hasn't been Americanized for international markets. The show has generated hundreds of millions in revenue. Bluey merchandise, books, and toys sell internationally. The Australian production company Ludo Studio became a major player in global children's entertainment. Bluey represents Australia exporting culture successfully without compromising Australian identity. The show is deeply Australian and globally successful simultaneously. Fact 97. Australia's deserts are called the Outback. The Australian Outback refers to remote, arid interior regions. It's not a specific geographic designation, but a cultural concept describing the vast, sparsely populated interior. The Outback covers most of Australia's landmass. It includes deserts like the Great Victoria Desert, Great Sandy Desert, and Simpson Desert. It also includes semi-arid grasslands and scrubland. The Outback has a population density of less than 1 person per square kilometre. Aboriginal people have lived there for tens of thousands of years, mastering desert survival. The Outback is central to Australian identity. Images of red dirt, clear skies, and vast emptiness represent Australia internationally. Tourism promotes the Outback as the real Australia, though most Australians live in coastal cities and never visit. The Outback is rich in mineral resources. Mining operations extract iron ore, gold, opals, and uranium from remote desert locations. Fly-in, fly-out workers live in coastal cities and work in Outback mines. The Outback represents Australia's empty heart, beautiful and harsh, sparsely populated and resource-rich, essential to Australian identity but distant from most Australians' lives. Fact 98. The Commonwealth Games were boycotted over apartheid. In 1986, Brisbane hosted the Commonwealth Games. The event was marred by a massive boycott over apartheid in South Africa. 32 countries boycotted the Games because British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher refused to support economic sanctions against apartheid South Africa. The boycott was led by African and Caribbean nations. The Brisbane Games proceeded with 26 nations participating instead of the expected 58. It was the largest boycott in Commonwealth Games history. The event was a political and financial embarrassment for Australia. The boycott highlighted divisions within the Commonwealth over apartheid. Australia and Britain maintained sporting ties with South Africa despite international pressure. African nations and others refused to participate in games hosted by countries supporting apartheid indirectly. The 1986 boycott accelerated international pressure on South Africa. The Commonwealth Games boycott, combined with Olympic boycotts and other sanctions, contributed to ending apartheid. The Brisbane Games are remembered for the boycott more than the sporting events. It was a moment when sport and politics collided, and Australia was on the wrong side of history. Fact 99. Sorry Day recognizes the stolen generations. National Sorry Day, observed on May 26th each year, commemorates the mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly the stolen generations. Sorry Day was first held in 1998, a year after the Bringing Them Home report detailed the removal of Aboriginal children. The report recommended an official apology, which didn't happen until 2008. Sorry Day is not a public holiday. It's a day of remembrance and reconciliation. Events are held across Australia where people acknowledge the harm done to Aboriginal people and commit to reconciliation. Schools hold special assemblies. Communities organise morning teas and gatherings. Many wear yellow ribbons as a symbol of support. The week following Sorry Day is National Reconciliation Week, ending on June 3rd, the anniversary of the 1992 Mabo decision. The week focuses on building relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Sorry Day represents Australia's ongoing struggle with its history of Indigenous mistreatment. The day acknowledges past wrongs while looking toward reconciliation and healing. For members of the stolen generations, Sorry Day is deeply personal. It's recognition of their suffering and survival. For other Australians, it's an opportunity to learn about history often omitted from education, and to commit to doing better. 99 facts about Australian history they didn't teach you in school. From convict ships to climate disasters, from genocides to gold rushes, from offshore detention to desert mysteries. This is Australian history, brutal, bizarre, and unfinished. The past isn't past. Aboriginal people still fight for land rights. Refugees remain detained offshore. The reef continues dying. Australia's history is ongoing, contested, and far more complex than any official narrative suggests. The question isn't what happened, it's what we do about it now.